Dr. Ramon Amaro will join me on stage to talk about his book, The Black Technical Object. And then I believe we'll have coffee break after and come back for Natasha Tonti's screening and our panel conversation. So Ramon, could you join me? I forgot to read Ramon's bio, of course. Dr. Ramon Amaro is Senior Researcher for Digital Culture and lead of -1, a digital culture research laboratory at the Nieuwe Instituut in Rotterdam. His writings, research, and artistic practice emerge at the intersections of Black study, digital culture, psychosocial study, and the critique of computational reason. Ramon holds a BSc in mechanical engineering, an MA in sociology, and a PhD in philosophy of technology. Before joining at Nieuwe Instituut, Ramon worked as a lecturer, assistant professor in art and visual cultures of the Global South at UCL London, engineering program, manager at the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, and quality design engineer at General Motors Corporation. His recent book, The Black Technical Object on Machine Learning and the Aspiration of Black Being, published by Sternberg in 2023, contemplates the abstruse nature of programming and mathematics and the deep incursion of racial hierarchy to inspire alternative approaches to contemporary algorithmic practice. Thank you for being with us, Ramon. I'll come sit with you now. It's nice to be on this level with you guys. So Ramon, reading your bio, it really strikes me how many different hats you wear and how many different degrees you have. And I was wondering if you could just tell us about your practice and how you kind of came to be where you are today.
This works, okay. First, thanks for the generous introduction. And thanks for having me here. I mean, it's quite a varied story. I started my career out, of course, as a design engineer in the automotive field. And of course, I was quite young. I actually started with the company when I was 16 and sort of I would spend sort of semesters in school and then semesters off working in this sort of American corporate type of environment. So I got a sort of like accelerated education into the systemic forces that sort of run our world today, especially those sort of capitalist forces. By the time I'd graduated, I found myself in this sort of design environment. And actually it was a sort of corporate experiment where they would put the design engineers actually in the manufacturing facility. Is modeled after a Japanese model. So the design engineers, instead of being hundreds of thousands of kilometers away, they would be in the facility so we could design real time, talk about efficiency, right? So they basically put the humans on the assembly line. But I noticed very early that actually all of the problems that I was trying to solve were human problems. So there wasn't a mechanical failure, it wasn't a design fault, it was someone had a divorce, or someone had depression, or someone had a bad day. But there were no languages within this environment in order to incorporate for that. So actually this process that was built for efficiency became inefficient because I would basically have to redesign parts just because there was no language to say this person just has a burnout and needs a break. But I also didn't have the languages to really think about this human technical relationship as well. So I left there, ended up in New York where I did engineering policy. So I think that was my sort of superficial attempt to try to understand something greater, just to see where the fields sort of were. That was a failed experiment. And then I sort of came to Europe, did a master's in sociology, and actually it had more to do with psychosocial studies and thinking about the sensory connection and proximity with external objects. So sort of very philosophical notion. Really early on, what I was trying to really think about is what happens when one comes into contact with technology, not just the sort of physical hardware and devices, but the algorithmic systems underneath. And then I just sort of continued that on in my PhD, and then somehow found myself in teaching in history of art departments, and now I work for a museum. So that's the sort of short of it.
And what is your relationship to art history then? Because I can understand the switch from engineering to policy to sociology, and then art history sometimes seems like such an ivory tower. How did you get there?
Well, I think I was fortunate enough. I did my PhD at Goldsmiths in London. And at the time, it was sort of, I like to describe it at the right place, right time kind of situation. At the time I was doing my PhD, there were more and more students who were sort of in the history of art, and Goldsmiths called visual culture, but also art students in art departments who were interested in technology in different types of ways and were negotiating with the anxieties sort of around it. But there weren't many people at the time on faculty that were actually dealing with technology. And so there was a sort of opportunity for me to sort of fill that slot. And so I basically became very quickly I think I was probably at this time the only one on faculty without a dedicated history of art background. So I had to learn it myself. And then I basically just became self-taught, and then that's how I got into Black aesthetics and then thinking about the sort of concerns I think about now.
Interesting. And then fast forwarding to your role at Nieuwe Instituut as a curator, what is your curatorial practice like, and what is your day-to-day like there?
There, it's quite varied there as well. Because we're the National Institute, in case you don't know, the Nieuwe Instituut is the National Institute for the Architecture, Design, and Digital Culture. And we hold the National Archives, of course, for architecture and urban planning. The Institute was actually formed about 10 years ago just due to budget cuts, because there used to be an Institute of Architecture, used to be an Institute of Design, and we know how our politicians are. They decided to combine those and then haphazardly slapped on digital culture. So those two pillars of architecture and design were always very strong. But there is a strong legacy of thinking about research in digital culture as well in Rotterdam at the Nieuwe Instituut. But the folks that were doing that sort of moved on to different areas of study, and so they had this sort of gap in thinking about how do we rejuvenate digital culture, what does it mean to do it on behalf of OCW and the ministry, what is digital culture or policy, those types of things. So that's why I kind of was brought on board to kind of address those bigger questions. How it relates curatorially, it's kind of an odd museum because we don't have a central curatorial team. We all curate as a project, which is quite strange, and artists find it sometimes disconcerting when like a production manager is doing curatorial work, because they're like, who are you? What do you know about color? But we all do curatorial work. But when I arrived, my first remit, basically I was asked on my first or second day, a very complicated question, and it was, what is digital culture? What does digital culture mean for the Netherlands? What does it mean on behalf of the ministry? What does it mean outside of the Netherlands?
What was your answer?
Well, I did what I knew best, and I went on a sort of 2 to 3 month sociological research. So I went to visit institutions, talked to people internally, talked to different stakeholders. I basically ran my little mini sociological study. And the one thing that came out of this study is there are just as many definitions as people you talk to. And what I sort of convinced them is that instead of actually us defining what digital culture is on behalf of a population, why don't we do something that's closer to my research and actually live with the contingency and live with the tensions and the mess of not having a transparent definition. And really where that led me is that actually it led to a very sort of what I feel is for a simple concept, which is when we think about our sort of public engagements with digital culture, when we think about even our discursive engagements, it comes with certain basic assumptions. and that assumptions are already lives within other fields. So in architecture, you have a practice, you have discourse around it, you have creative practice, but the average public can imagine that there's an architect, right? Like, we don't know how they designed this room. We may not know that, but we know that there's a human being, and now also non-human beings that are aiding and designing it. And the same thing happens with design practice as well, right? There's actually a human being. But when we think about digital culture, it's really difficult for us to imagine, even though we're concerned about the human relationship with it, it's difficult for us to imagine the humans that are involved in it. So, for instance, the Harun Farokhi film, actually showing the drone operator, right? For me, that is the real black box. The black box isn't the data that's not revealed, because even if it is revealed, it's incomprehensible. It do nothing for you, right? It does nothing for me to have my data. I'm not going to do anything with it, right? But what is in a black box is actually what types of proximities we all have to these different types of technologies. And so what I wanted to bring back and basically say curatorially is what I wanted to show is that in the making and exhibiting and the producing of digital culture, this is digital culture. So I started a residency program where we bring in early career researchers. We have them install existing works, sometimes in prototype. Right? And really what I want to do is show that when we think about digital culture, this individual is digital culture. It's not just the Google engineer, it's not just the drone pilot, it's actually the creatives, the makers, those that are concerned with it. And so that's how I kind of curate through that practice.
And I think it's quite almost confronting to think about what the definition is for digital culture. And as much as I work on the topic, I don't know if I would have a ready definition for it. My immediate thought was, do we not all create digital culture? But then is that, almost in a way that's quite banal?
Absolutely, and I think that's the tension there, is that when we actually look at this grand question of what is digital culture, for me, it's something that's processual, it's in process, it's in contact, it's in one making, it's in one thinking about, it is one absorbing and actually reacting to, right? For me, it's a parasitic relationship that doesn't see a sort of beginning and end between human and machine, but actually sees something that's continual and symbiotic. Because, the fact is what we already know, is these technologies in which we are confronted by and we have certain neuroses with is a product of our own creation. And so for me, the problem isn't that it's something separate, whether it's internal or external, but that we as a society have become conditioned, to follow Simondon, have become conditioned to identifying an other and a stranger that we do not understand. And in that misunderstanding is where we transpose all of our anxieties and neuroses and violences and so on and so forth. And so what I'm trying to do is recapture that relationship and in a way refocus it as not necessarily a technological problem, but a psychosocial human problem in that type of sense. And by doing so, what I'm hoping to do is not only sort of relieve the anxiety and neuroses that we have in relationship to tech, but then also thinking about different ways in which we can engage that become a bit more fugitive, that actually seek to recapture our own psychosocial well-being and think about how livability in life and sustainability can actually happen within the duress of the world that we kind of live in.
I think that this is a really good segue to speak about your book, The Black Technical Object. Could you give us an introduction of what the book is and the basic concepts?
So the book is kind of I guess first I should say that the book is written in a circle. It's kind of a choose your own adventure. You don't really know that when you sort of encounter it. But it was really the only way to kind of write it. But in thinking about this relationship, I was really inspired by a story. This what the book starts with, an essay I had previously wrote called As If, which I retooled as the introductory chapter for the book. And those that don't know, I think it was around 2019, there's a computer scientist named Joy Balawimi. I always butcher her name. She's absolutely fantastic. She was at MIT, and she built a facial recognition system called the Aspire Mirror. And in building this, of course, it was one of those early interventions where she realized she couldn't test her own prototype because it couldn't recognize her darker skin tones. Now, the purpose of this machine was quite extraordinary. It was, you were supposed to look into a box, and then the machine would show you your spirit animal. Cool, right? So it's already very speculative, Octavia Butler, like we can Sun Ra, you can put all that wrapped up into this sort of Aspire machine. And that aspiration had already been infused with her having Ghanaian roots. It had to do with her sort of culturally, spirituality, placement, her own body, her own identity that gets projected through the machine as something that she can't imagine. So we can see the kind of parasitic relationship that's there. But because she couldn't test her own machine, of course, after that, she basically her career took a turn. And what she said is that she wanted to reverse the coded gaze. I'm gonna come back to that because that's the important part for me. And since she's had a very accomplished career, I think she's absolutely fantastic. But my first reaction to this was, first, how sad. And secondly, what the heck happened to the spirit animal? So, and why this is important, and I'll try to make this short, and why this is important is in my studies with post-colonial theory, thinking about German idealism, even going back to the stage of humanism, which you were talking about earlier, I really had a sort of fascination with early writings with Frantz Fanon. And in those early writings, basically what he is saying in a psychosocial sense is that the problem with colonialism wasn't necessarily an external problem. The problem with colonialism is that it actually created a psychosocial gap between the colonizers and the colonized. And for those that were colonized, that this psychosocial gap resulted in what he called 1,000 manifestations of a psychic break. Whereby one can only relate to themselves in relationship to that which oppresses them. And so Fanon goes back to Lacan and thinking about this sort of mirror phase, and he's thinking about how actually this external perception of the world isn't some universalized condition, that these are already preconditioned by certain logics, and for Fanon, this was race and colonialism. So he's basically saying before we even perceive, we're already perceiving ourselves in lack compared to the racialized stereotypes that we have before we're born, so that by the time we're born, we already see ourselves in relationship to that which we're not. And that creates the neuroses. So what Fanon is saying is that our anxiety in the world is who we think we are, who we know we are, and the person in which we're perceived to be, because they're never in alignment, right? That's why when you're minding your own business and someone cat calls you, that's the anxiety. It's not an anxiety of the cat call, it's an anxiety because you know to your true heart who you are is not a whistle, and someone sees you as a body, right? So in this sense, I wanted to think about what does it then mean for Black individuals, for this young woman to then adopt the return to the object outside of herself instead of going to the generative capacity of life and through the duress in which she had already transposed to do with the Aspire machine. And so that took me down a very philosophical journey that sort of went roundabout. But through that journey is something that I'd already done. Just a little side note, I don't like to talk about technology unless I know what I'm talking about. So I learned machine learning. I thought it was super boring. Sorry, computer scientist. So I never wanted to do it, but I had to learn it because I wanted to see the algorithms. And then in seeing the algorithms, I was able to break them down into their mathematical functions. And then once I was able to break them down into their mathematical functions, I was able to trace the root of those mathematics down to their conception. And so what the book does is it follows this journey on how these maths were conceived. We're talking early 16th, 17th century. How they were conceived, and then the racialized logics which already collided with them. And so basically what the book is saying is that all of the racial duress we're experiencing now was preconditioned hundreds of years ago. It was just never able to materialize. And I wanted to kind of set that condition to then say, if this is presupposed, then the result of that means that the duress we experience has already been pre-perceived. And if it's pre-perceived, there's no point in being neurotic now because we're talking about a specter. So can we actually reduce that neuroses and then go to a different generative place through the duress that we experience? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Sorry, it was very long. Does that
No, I think it's of course some philosophical precepts, but I think that maybe if I would put it in a different set of terms, for example, with was it called the spirit machine?
It was the Aspire mirror.
Aspire mirror.
Yeah.
In that case, if this machine weren't going to recognize the face of a Black woman, putting more data that would help the machine to recognize the face of a Black woman wouldn't necessarily help. It would just be a kind of furthering of a kind of machine that is based on a racist technology.
Yeah, but that's okay. It's okay for the Black being. And I know it's controversial to say that. And the reason why it's okay for the Black being is because when you look at the emergence of the mathematics that actually run the algorithms that then generalize those images, they were already conditioned to generalize difference in itself. They were never made to account for difference. So me being concerned about an algorithm not recognizing my Black characteristics or being concerned that it excludes my Black characteristics is the same as me going to a police officer and being surprised that they stereotype me, right? It's already ingrained within the systemic logics of. So each time we're surprised, we actually bring it back to life. So it's actually, what I'm suggesting is it's a feigned surprise. And and because it's a feigned surprise, I'm not saying it's not important. I'm not saying that it's not something that we should resist. But what I'm afraid of, just like with Joy, who's brilliant, is that it will distract us from what Fred Moten and Saidiya Hartman have been trying to warn us about, is that through the duress of the Black being is also life. And we cannot actually produce life if we continue to relate ourselves to that which suppresses us. It's not ignoring that which suppresses us, but it actually is actually breaking that Hegelian master-slave dialectic where one can only recognize themselves by that which they're not. That's why I'm saying that. So for me to recognize the algorithm for that which excludes me from is for me giving a false power to the algorithmic process when all it's doing is replicating the superficiality of what it's been trained to do. I don't want to talk to the superficial. I want to talk to the real. And so I let the superficial be superficial. I let it actually, and it comes with a certain, which is important in the book, is basically what I'm saying is that what I try to do is suspend the hypotheses of a lack of escape. So what if we can't escape capital intervention? What if we cannot escape the algorithmic intervention? Then what actually possibilities of livability then live within that mechanism as opposed to thinking about a mechanism that's outside of escape? And this sort of goes to a deeper critique that I kind of put, I'll kind of put very controversially, but the vision that we tend to seek through data and through algorithms is a fantasy that has yet to be realized. We as a human species have never experienced equitability. We have never experienced the lack of discrimination. We have never experienced a perceptual framework which doesn't identify someone as an other and enact violence on other. So why should we put that burden on a machine? So we're actually doing the opposite. We're not asking the machine to be equitable. What we're doing is shifting our own accountability to be equitable onto that which was never trained to do it.
And what is the space of resistance then within this context?
I think what I look at in the book is as soon as I converge, what I try to do is once I converge the logic, I start with the early statistics into machine learning, which I don't know if most people realize this, that first statistics emerged into pattern recognition, computer science. Machine learning came into invention. It was difficult to distinguish statistics from machine learning because they use the same tools interchangeably. This is about the 1950s. And then AI split off in the 1980s. Machine learning and AI are closely related, and now we just subsume them all under artificial intelligence. And why am I saying that? What was the question? I got distracted.
What's the space for resistance?
There we go. So basically, once I trace those logics, those historical logics, and I see the social, political, and economic implications of those, I start with a sort of I go back to a basic assumption that Fanon said. And I pulled it up because I never remember it by heart. So if you give me just one moment, I'm going to say it. So Fanon has a quote in Black Skin, White Mass that underpins essentially his entire thesis. And I'm noticing this on my other phone. And basically, to summarize this quote, what he is saying is that he's a man, sick, because Fanon's problematic, right? When he sees men. He's a man that's desirous to find the world. He basically wants to find himself in the world, and doing so has a desire to learn the world. But in doing so, he finds himself as just being an object amongst other objects. And so what I try to imagine is that what if the Black individual, the racialized individual, and I'm talking about the body of difference, the being of any kind of categorical difference, where we're talking about queerness, transness, gender, all those types of categories. What if we continue to be relegated as objects in themselves? And as objects, what if we're also, if we believe Fanon, fragmented into 1,000 little pieces? If that is the case, that means we're closer to the data than we actually are to anything else, which is also relegated to an object, fragmented and generalized in a certain type of area. So basically, I do a fantasy thing. I should make an animation about this. Basically, I take the Black body, I suspend it as an object, I break it down into 1,000 manifestations, and I push it through the algorithm. And what I'm looking for in the mathematics themselves are breaches of possibility. So those moments of possibility of creation, those moments of, even if they're a microsecond, of generative capacity, what I'm looking for are moments of escape within that. And what I mean by that is when we look at certain processes of machines talking to machines, I guess if we go to Kate was talking about the neural networks. Most sophisticated neural networks now are thousands of layers and of how they work. They're kind of a design behind the brain. And they have this sort of input, and there's like thousands of layers, and then there's an output. What's not as well known is that past a certain amount of layers is no longer comprehensible by humans. This is the trick, Silicon Valley. That's what I want you to know. You only know it works by the output. But there is a level of computation within the neural network that is only comprehensible by other machines. And so what I want to do is I want to push that Black being into that contingent speculative space and then see what possibilities of life can come. And it's basically made on a principle assumption of what I said, is that actually in our historical sense of how we treat racialized people, what I'm sort of hypothesizing is we have a better chance within the contingency of an algorithmic process than a human process, because it lives outside of our conceptions of conception in which we have yet to experience.
Could you speak a bit about the title, Black Technical Object?
Yeah, so that is sort of really what I just described is that kind of title. So basically, I'm looking to speculatively assume that I basically am starting. If I back up a second, what I wanted to see is that if Fanon lived today and encountered machine learning, what would he think about machine learning? But then we encounter a couple of problems. I mean, Fanon did talk about technology, and this is where the resistance and the capability comes. When he joined the FLN, the Algerian resistance, well, first I should back up, just a little history lesson on Fanon. So basically at the age of like 36, no pressure, he was leading a psychiatric hospital in the south of France. And he started running experiments, basically therapy experiments. And what he noticed was that the same therapies that he would give the white French soldiers was working, but it was not working on the Algerian soldiers. And that's where he began to theorize that colonialism wasn't just a physical impact, it was something that was psychosocial. But because it's psychosocial, then he changed his therapeutic methodology to not cure something, but to show potential of. So he then had to show the Algerians that they were human again. And he had to show them that they had the potential to usurp whatever they go. And he used this later when he joined the resistance during the Algerian War. Of course, the technology then wasn't as sophisticated as now, but there's a couple of small antidotes that he used. I'll tell quickly. At one point during the war, France was pumping in propaganda into Algeria across the radio waves. And the first impulse, this goes back to the Joy story, the first impulse of the resistance fighters was to turn the radio off, clip the radio wire. See, you recognize the other in the oppression of the call. Fanon said, don't clip the wire, because he said, in if we look at the technological apparatus, the power comes in assuming that it is exactly what it is, which is a wire that transmits sound, which meant if France can pump in propaganda into an Algeria, that meant that Algeria could pump propaganda into France, and that's exactly what they did. So he was training them that actually, if they see themselves as having the same potential as power itself, they themselves psychologically will make different decisions to write the categories. And that's also how he taught the transfer of arms through the border, because most of the arms during that time were actually transferred by women. And they were only transferred by women because the soldiers at the border could not think beyond the logics of gender in itself. A woman wouldn't have a gun, so they were never searched. And so those are the moments that I'm trying to look for within the algorithmic process, those moments that ride the category and the logics that then become naturalized and invisible to us, and then allow us to actually do something beyond those logics with actually, essentially while staying invisible.
And thank you. And in addition to Fanon, you also reference Foucault. Could you speak a little bit about that reference as well?
I mentioned several sort of references in the book that's there. The interesting thing about Fanon and Foucault for me, and Simone Brown talks about this quite a lot, is that it's unknown. They're contemporaries. Fanon was also hanging out with Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir and Deleuze and Guattari. They were all in the same crew, basically. And if you read Black Skin, White Mass, it actually is very similar to Fanon's concept of biopolitics. Fanon's actually conception of psychosocial being is very similar. And then Simone Brown, of course, tells us that it's known that Foucault was attending Fanon's lectures and that Fanon was attending Foucault's lectures, but what's unknown is how much they influenced each other. But if you read them side by side, and actually if you read Simone Dunn's On the Mode of Technical Existence, if you read all three of those side by side, they're all biopolitical in between. So what I decided to do is not center Foucault, but actually just make reference to that type of conversation. And then I take both of those, Fanon and Foucault, and then go to Sylvia Wynter, who I think does a more beautiful job.
Interesting. I was also wondering if you feel like your practice as an engineer has influenced your writing style at all, or the process of writing and your process of thinking.
Yeah, I write like an engineer. The first essay I ever wrote was during my master's. Yeah, I was like, I gotta do what? But actually, it's also how I fell in love with theory and philosophy. Because the only way I could sort of manage that was to treat it as an object to deconstruct in an engineering sense. So I would take philosophy books and I would make schematics out of them and I would deconstruct them to get the argument. And then what I would do is train myself to, I would rehearse my argument within their writing until I found my own language to sort of write it. So I built it like Legos. These days, what I do is I like to describe it as sort of layering it like a painting. So I build an initial shell of a schematic, and then I layer on certain textures, and then I take it to different pathways. So my brain still thinks in that.
How do you physically do that? Like, do you make like a collage or a mood board or something?
Actually, usually when at the end of my writing, usually what I'll do is get scissors and tape, and I have to put it on the wall, and I have to that's why the book's actually written in a circle, because I realized soon on I was organizing it, and each time I organized it, it was always just a different order. So I just decided to write it in a circle. But nowadays, yeah, I've become more, I've trained myself I don't have to sort of cut and paste anymore. I can sort of see it before I write it. But I did go through a long time printing it out. I would cut it, put it on the wall, and basically make a collage.
That's fascinating. There's also, like, within the practice of logic, like the mathematical practice of logic, I forget what they're called, like a logic flow, where you can map out arguments. That was one of the most useful classes I had taken in art school, actually. And it kind of takes the emotion out of an argument and focuses on types of arguments, types of logic that you're using in order to build the most strong possible argument.
Yeah, I mean, I think in that sense, I have sort of resisted those movements in a sense, because I think when we're talking about certain levels of duress, that emotions aren't something that, I have to sort of resist this Kantian moment in which, with these rational beings which have, on-off switch with our emotions. I prefer like a Burkean emotion, speaking of history of art, where, it's something that's just innate with us that we can negotiate with. So when I'm going through a logical process, it's already informed by my trans-historical duress and in my present duress, because that's what's driving a solution to that, is what's driving it. But it also helps me keep centered in the terms of compassion, because it's that duress which reduces my proximity to other forms of difference. And so that's why I can empathize with it, I can act upon it without having to experience it, because I can carry with me my own transgenerational trauma, and then all I have to do is then imagine another person's, right? So I just have to imagine, and then I have to make that logical connection. So one example is I'm thinking about, so if I have to think about maybe any identification of women and safety, it is possible that, let's say, I might be sexually assaulted, but statistically, it's less possible than those that identify in certain types of ways. But what I have come into proximity to are people that I know and people that I see that have experienced those things and the trauma and the nightmares that they experience. So logically, all I have to do is tap into my worst nightmare and then imagine it's worse for her. See, I don't have to be assaulted. I just have to make the logical link of duress, and then I'm already in allyship and solidarity. And then it becomes, how can we then work in solidarity to reduce the dynamics of that violence?
I was just going to ask if you would name that allyship, indeed, and solidarity. Would you say that this is one of the larger kind of aims of your work?
Yeah, I'm thinking, I think being influenced by Fanon in this sense, because ultimately what Fanon wanted was a new type of humanism. What he wanted, because what he basically stated is that in order for racism to basically end, not only must the colonizer change, but the colonized must change as well. We must completely rewrite our own perceptions of humanity in itself, and then act upon that rewriting of it. And so for me in my work, I think that's what I'm building this methodology towards, is actually us not only rewriting the algorithm, but rewriting our own selves that can then go into concert with the algorithm. And it's based on a sort of basic principle, right? We all know at this point that algorithmic process is a mirror of our social, political, and economic processes. And I'm asked all the time, like, you know, what is the solution? And to me, it's a simple answer, right? If we don't want the algorithm to be racist, then we need to stop being racist. It's just an echo. If we don't want it to actually do something, then we actually have the power to make it stop. You know, and I also think about, you know, what Professor Matthew Fuller says at Goldsmiths, you know, in his intervention with capitalism, and I tend to agree. And, you know, he says that in this contemporary moment, you know, capitalism is desperate. It's not in control, it's desperate. And it will go anywhere where it can extract. Which means that if we distract it, if we stop doing what we're doing, it will move on. It is only concerned about data and our algorithmic process because we keep reiterating the importance of, which means that it can capture, commodify, reduce, and exploit, and so on and so forth. I'm not saying it's a simple solution, and I'm definitely not saying, you know, this whole turn off your phone thing, right? I'm not a Luddite. You know, I do believe in some potential of these sort of technologies, but what I think is psychosocially that we have an opportunity to lower its importance, and in doing so, give capitalism a time to sort of move on.
I have so many questions, but I also want to open it to the floor. Does anyone have a burning question already? Not yet. Okay. Oh, yes. When?
Thank you so much. I'd love for you to dig into more of the sort of models of Black fugitivity that you're referring to, especially given the ways that it interrupts the sort of dialectic of, you know, power and resistance in some of the ways we might normally conceive it.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think in terms of fugitivity, it's a very difficult question because on its surface, methodologically, it seems quite simple, right? We all are empowered to be a fugitive into the systems which sort of suffocate us. And some of the typical historical examples, we're looking at sort of slave revolts, looking at other types of revolts where you have these sort of systemic types of things. I think the approach that I had is thinking about how we can continue to capture those very everyday systemic moments, whether that be from a protest, whether that be from this individual that then turns to creative making as opposed to other types of sort of oppressive networks, or where one enters into solidarity or allyship with someone else, and how that then is expressed and produced in creative sort of output. So that's sort of one sentence there. But where my work sort of led me, especially in thinking about the book and the sort of greater work, is I want to explore what it would look like if a fugitivity was completely glissant on overdrive, where it wasn't an opacity, but a complete abstraction, to whereby all of the perceptual sensories become dislodged to the point where the only thing that's left is an act of thought, as Denise Ferrar da Silva would say. The only thing that's left is the act of thought, which forces one to make a decision based on our own livability and being in themselves. So one of the things I began to start thinking about and referencing is the sort of Black abstraction movement in the United States, you know, Jack Whitten and Beard and, you know, all these sort of folks. What's important about that moment is, if you're not familiar with the paintings of Black abstraction, it was just sort of a movement that, of course, came from Europe. There were different interpretations of that movement. And then there was a very small community within the States that were sort of spread out, that were just doing these sort of abstract paintings. But this was at the time of the American sort of civil rights movement at the same time. And what would happen would be something very interesting is they would have community exhibitions, solo shows, group shows. And this is inflammatory to say because I don't know this, but my perception and reading around it is everyone hated Jack. And the reason why they hated Jack It's really strong language. I think they were just annoyed with Jack because some police violence would erupt in some city. This group would respond by running a bunch of artists would respond by running a group exhibition that would address that police violence. But most of the exhibited artworks were very representational and explicit. A door with bullet holes, a police siren with this, or a fake body on the floor. And then the black abstractionists would show up with an abstract painting. And so they would basically go, Jack, what the hell is this? This is supposed to be about police violence. Why did you give me this painting that just has a strip of pink across it? And then Jack would respond and say, this is police violence. Or he would respond and say, this is the condition of America, and maybe it would just be a triangle, or maybe it would just be a wave. And I start thinking about what that type of contingency and moment, because you see it completely breaks the perceptual lens and forces one into the sensory. So now I have to imagine how the light waves of pink might relate to the duress of police violence. See, it forces me into a completely different headspace before I even make the decision. And so that's where I'm trying to pick up on what an algorithmic process might look like if it actually adopted a sense of abstraction, and if we allow ourselves as beings of difference to also adopt that same sense of abstraction, then we wouldn't be so distracted by ChatGPT coming up with a new poem. We would be producing things, livability, probably every millisecond. So that's where I'm sort of trying to build up to.
Thank you, Ramon. Did we have any other questions so far? Yes, here.
I'm not really sure how to formulate this question because it is as complicated as the topics we're trying to tackle, right? So I was just thinking, like, we're trying to shift the paradigm, or like just unlearn this advantage, right? So you were talking about the war between France and Algeria, and if the Algerians like just unlearned the disadvantage, if they had just thought that we are as powerful as the other, then they would have, then that's where the action is, right? Okay, so this is about bias, but I feel like the bias also has this covert nature that can be taken advantage of, which you also mentioned, like it can, like if you're, I feel like you need to look at it from like an elevated POV to actually see what's happening, and you need to make use of those loopholes. For example, like in Wolf of Wall Street, how women used to wrap around coke all over themselves to fly because they wouldn't search women. It's the same thing. So what do you, I don't know where the question is actually.
No, thank you for actually bringing that up. I think it's essentially important. And also, thank you for being brave enough to do it and talking to me in this conversational way. But it allows me to actually explain a bit differently. So first, what I'm coming from is a basic philosophical assumption between the individual and the particular. Some call it the universal. So the first basic assumption is that the individual and the particular cannot be distinguished. You are both individual, you also particular. So when I speak to the individual, I'm already speaking to community. When I speak to community, I'm already speaking to you. So that wraps that one. The second, when I talk about the psychosocial break, unfortunately, it's not as easy as saying, well, the Algerians, if they had known, because we're talking about a deep psychic reperception. And here I turn to Kara Keeling in Queer Times, Black Futures, Queer Time. I always get it wrong. It's a brilliant book. I'm not going to say this, sorry, Kara Keeling, but the first page will blow your mind. And the reason why the first page just blows your mind is just she starts with the idea that we were never meant to survive. We were always meant to change. And what she meant by that is that not only in this biological process are we always in a state of flux and change, like who we were at the start of this symposium is dead. We're new people. But she also means psychosocially. We were never actually meant to maintain the same solid form of a psychosocial existence. However, we've become conditioned as humans to hold on to this idealized form of ourselves. And she's also building on Fanon. So what Fanon is basically saying, when he's saying that it's a psychosocial switch, what he's saying is you have to annihilate the entire psychosocial, which is almost impossible, right? You have to completely break it down. So his new humanism is actually based on a complete erasure and reset. It's not based on, let me think differently, right? Exactly. It's not based on, well, only if I recognize my power. It's actually based on that moment of principle that Fred Moten picks up from Fanon, because in the break, I think it's in the first couple of pages of In the Break, I'll summarize it here, but Fred Moten says, imagine there's nothing wrong with blackness. And I've said this before in other talks, but even the psychosocial power of imagining that there's nothing wrong with you already gives you, it's like therapy on hyperdrive. It's like, imagine that day where you got your new fit, you got a good hat, the makeup is on point, the face is beat. Before you even leave the house, no one can tell you anything. And what Fred Moten is basically saying is that's fugitivity. So when you walk into a space that is already infused in a racialized infusion, it doesn't matter actually what forces come at you, because there's nothing wrong with my blackness, which means that the reflection of that Lacanian gaze is inconsequential. That's what I'm saying Joy missed. Because Joy is building an Aspire machine. Joy is about to get a Nobel Prize. What does she care? You see? And now she's just given the power back to, and we still don't have an Aspire machine. So what if each one of us actually built our own Aspire machines? Whether that's a machine or an act of thought or an act of solidarity or act of community. What if we actually not ignore the duress that created it, right? Because we don't want to be naive in that sense. But what if we move towards that type of contingency from a place for the sole purposes of eradicating the systemic violences that have already conditioned how we act in this world? And in doing so, I guarantee you within a microsecond, the algorithm will follow. Because that's what it's designed to do.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to jump in? Oh yeah, we have a question over here. Comments are also welcome.
Well, first of all, thank you for pushing me to a zone that I enjoy a lot, where I feel as vividly clear as abstract and a lot of questions. But I was thinking of a sort of dilemma. If Fanon is advocating, or his mission was to redefine what it means to be human, and I was wondering about this definition of human that leads us to the definition of life, and also death. And for me, there is a bit of a dead end to think of like algorithms or machine learning systems where their notion of mortality is very hard to grasp or imagine even. As you said, even capitalism will just keep on going forever. And so how can we redefine what life and death is with systems that are not in those terms? I don't know, what is this proximity between these two?
Where have you been? Because I had to write a whole new chapter of the book on this question.
Oh, wow.
So in the book, basically, I have this really obscure chapter where I'm trying to go back to the philosophical origin of being. That's why it's Black Being. And I resist calling it a body or presence, and I just want it to be something. I don't have a lot of space to go into philosophically this sort of origin of the idea of this concept as us as fully formed beings that we then conceptualize into this idea of human. But what I attempt to do is look at alternative theories which look at different conceptions of what a human might be, which is what led me to Simondon. So for Simondon, our recognizable forms are what he calls amplifications of an existing preset of conditions that then form and we recognize. So I like to think of it as, imagine the ocean, and then the wave comes up in the ocean, that's our body, and then it flows back. That's Karakeeling, and it was never meant to survive. It was meant to flow back into the energetic conditions and then flow back up into a new type of form. The problem with the Enlightenment up into eugenics and the Kantian moment is it forced us to solidify this perfect idea of human, which became the white European heterosexual male. That's the problem. They solidified the wave into a prototype of a specific type of person. This is what Sylvia Wynter talks about. And in creating that type of prototype, created even an anxiety in which other white Europeans couldn't even live up to, right? And then it became, that's what Wynter calls this type of ceremony, because that ceremony was never realized. And now with the dismantling, the present dismantling of that type of form is quite damning. What Sylvia Wynter is saying is we've become so conditioned to having a ceremonial figure as that prototype that now we're just looking for the next ceremony. And what I'm arguing is that next ceremony is the algorithm. That's why I don't want to focus on it anymore. It's not going to save us. It doesn't matter what it does. It's never going to save us. We have to actually return back to that moment where we see ourselves within a constant system of relationships that are both particular as also as universal, that includes a set of conditions that have materialized into how we live in this world, but does not exclude the fact that these conditions are a product of what we created, and therefore, if us as creatives can create, we can create different conditions whereby we become different individuals. So that's where I'm wrapping. But we have to break the othering before we can do that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ramon, for this conversation. I think it's time to wrap up. It's 3:15. We can, of course, talk during the break, but now we're going to have a coffee, and we'll come back and watch Natasha Tonzi's work. Thank you.
Thank you.